Her hands were shaking when she crossed that threshold, not from fear, but from something heavier, from knowing she didn't belong there. Not in that grand house, not among those polished people, not in their world of silk and silence and old money. But Eliza Harper had made a promise to her dying mother, and Harper women didn't break promises. So she lifted her chin, steadied her breath, and walked into the Van Dorn estate with nothing but a worn leather bag and a greeting her grandmother had taught her. A greeting that would change everything. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to this channel and follow Eliza all the way to the end. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Eliza Harper arrived at the Van Dorn estate, she was 22 years old, had exactly $4 to her name. One change of clothes, rolled tight in a leather bag, and the memory of her mother's voice saying the same thing over and over in those last weeks. Keep your mouth shut and your eyes open, girl. Keep your mouth shut and your eyes open. She'd repeated it to herself the whole ride from the station, sitting straight-backed in the hired cart, the summer heat pressing down on her shoulders like a judgment. The driver hadn't spoken a single word to her since she told him where she was headed. When she mentioned the Van Dorn name, he'd just clicked his tongue at the horse and looked away. She understood that response. Back in Hollow Creek, Massachusetts, you didn't say the Van Dorn name lightly either. It was old money, old blood. The kind of family that had been writing the rules so long they'd forgotten there were other ways to live. But they were hiring, and Eliza needed the work. Mrs. Whitmore met her at the servants' entrance, which was exactly where Eliza expected to be met. The housekeeper was a narrow-framed woman, perhaps 60, with iron-gray hair pulled so tight against her skull that Eliza thought it must ache by evening. Her eyes went to work immediately measuring Eliza from the hem of her skirt to the top of her bonnet before she'd finished climbing the back steps. "Eliza Harper," the woman said. Not a question. "Yes, ma'am." "From Hollow Creek." "Born and raised." Mrs. Whitmore's mouth drew in at the corners the way a purse string does when you pull it tight. "We don't bring that kind of speech in here. Plain English. Proper English. When you are spoken to, you answer directly and briefly. When you are not spoken to, you are not heard. Are we understood?" "Yes, ma'am." "You will address Mr. Nathaniel Van Dorn as sir. Always. No exceptions." She turned, and Eliza followed her through a corridor that smelled of beeswax and something older cedar maybe, or old paper. "The elder, Mr. Van Dorn, Mr. Samuel. You will not address at all. If he enters a room you're working in, you step back, lower your eyes, and continue your task quietly. He does not tolerate conversation with the staff." Eliza kept pace. "And if he speaks to me first, Mrs. Whitmore stopped, turned around so slowly that Eliza had time to feel the foolishness of the question. "He won't," the woman said. That settled it. She was given a room barely wide enough to stretch her arms in a list of duties that covered morning to evening, and a uniform that fit close enough to work in. The other housemaids, 3 of them ranging from a girl younger than Eliza to a woman closer to 40, were polite in the way people are polite when they haven't decided yet whether they like you. They gave her the basics over dinner that first evening. The hours, the rotations, which hallways got dusty fastest, which rooms the elder Mr. Van Dorn liked, kept closed. "He keeps to the east wing mostly," said Dolly, the youngest, a freckle-faced girl who talked with her hands. "His room's his study. He has his meals brought up more often than not. You probably won't see him more than twice a week if you're careful." "What does careful look like?" Eliza asked. Dolly exchanged a look with the older woman, Ruth. "Don't be where he is," Ruth said simply, "and don't talk." "To him specifically, or in general?" "Both," said the third maid, Clara, without looking up from her plate. Eliza almost smiled. She didn't. So, the first week passed, the way all first weeks do. She was tired, in a way she hadn't expected, the kind of tired that settles into your legs and lower back and doesn't lift even when you sleep. She learned the house, its rhythms, the way the morning light moved through the front rooms, and the way Nathaniel Van Dorn moved through his day, purposefully quietly, like a man who had somewhere to be, and didn't allow himself the luxury of uncertainty. She saw him only at a distance those first days. He was tall, dark-haired, not unpleasant to look at, but there was something in the set of his jaw and the way he held himself, some kind of grief pulled inward and pressed flat, that made him seem older than his years. The staff said his wife had died 3 winters back. Fever took her. He'd been measured and serious before that, they said, but after the warmth that had been there once or twice went away and didn't come back. "Does he ever laugh?" Eliza asked Dolly one afternoon. Dolly looked at her like she'd asked if the house could fly. "I've been here 4 years," she said. "Not once." Eliza thought about that more than she should have. It was on a Thursday, she was certain of it later. Certain because she'd been counting the days, and Thursday was the one she'd allowed herself to feel the loneliness fully just for an hour before pressing it back down, that she was sent to the East Wing study to lay the morning fire. It was early. Too early for most of the household to be moving. She had the firebox in one hand and the ash bucket in the other, and she went about the work the way she'd learned, quietly, efficiently, trying to take up less space than her body actually required. The study was the kind of room that had been lived in for a long time. She could feel the weight of that, without seeing much. The shelves thick with books, the desk layered with papers, the faint smell of pipe tobacco gone cold. She kept her eyes on her work. Didn't look around. "Keep your eyes open," her mother had said. But she'd also learned quickly that in the Van Dorn house there was looking, and then there was looking, and the second kind got you in trouble. She was just rising from her knees, brushing ash from her apron, when the door opened. She did not startle. She had trained herself out of that response years ago. Startling when you were the daughter of a woman who'd worked herself into an early grave, taught you that surprises were just things you hadn't anticipated yet, and the best response to them was stillness. So she stilled, turned halfway, lowered her eyes. The man who entered was not Nathaniel Van Dorn. She knew that immediately. The step was slower, more deliberate, the weight of it different. And when she cut her eyes upward for just a moment, just to calibrate, she saw that he was older, much older, white-haired, broad in the shoulders still, but carrying the slight curve of a man who'd been fighting gravity for 7 decades and was beginning to feel the negotiation. His coat was fine. His hands, she noticed in that one glance, were clasped behind him. Samuel Van Dorn. Eliza's stomach dropped clean through the floor. She stepped back toward the wall, immediately kept her eyes down, and tried to make herself into furniture. "He won't speak to you," Mrs. Whitmore had said. "He doesn't talk to the staff." He stopped moving. She could feel him looking at her. The way you can feel weather coming, even when the sky still looks clear. She waited, kept her hands folded, kept her eyes low. "You're new," he said. His voice was rougher than she'd expected, like gravel that had been worn smooth in places, but was still gravel underneath. "Yes, sir," she said, quietly, properly. "Where from?" She hesitated. "Massachusetts, sir. Hollow Creek." Something shifted in the room. She couldn't have said what, not a sound exactly, just a quality of attention that changed, tightened the way air changes before lightning. "Hollow Creek," he repeated. Flat, like he was placing it on a table to look at it. "Yes, sir." He didn't say anything else. She hoped that would be the end of it. She kept her eyes down. Waited for him to move to his desk, waited for the sound of his chair, waited for dismissal by indifference. Instead, she heard him take one more step toward her, and her nerves betrayed her. It was automatic. It was years of Hollow Creek running in her blood like a current she'd never been able to dam up entirely. It was her grandmother's kitchen, and Sunday mornings, and the way the whole town greeted its elders, because that was what you did. That was the only thing that ever felt right. That was the greeting her grandmother had pressed into her like a brand before she died. "Fare thee, bright old one." The words were out of her mouth before she knew they were coming. The silence that followed was not like any silence Eliza had ever heard. It wasn't the silence of a man offended. It wasn't the silence of a man preparing to reprimand her. It wasn't even the silence of confusion. It was the silence of a man who had stopped existing for a moment. She looked up because she couldn't help it. Some instinct that said, "Look up, something is wrong," and she saw him. Samuel Van Dorn had gone white. Not pale. White. The way paper is white, the way something is white, when the blood has simply stopped cooperating. His clasped hands had come apart. One of them was pressed flat against the edge of the desk beside him, and she understood in a sudden sick flash of clarity that he was holding himself up with it. His eyes were fixed on her face. She had seen grief before. She had seen her mother's grief slow and patient and quiet. She had seen the grief of neighbors who'd lost children, lost livestock, lost the season's crops. She knew what grief looked like when it was old and settled. But this, what she saw in Samuel Van Dorn's face in that moment, this was grief that had never settled. This was grief that had been locked in a room for decades and had just had the door flung open. "Sir." Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. I shouldn't have said that. It was forward of me. It was wrong of me." "I don't know what. Where did you learn that?" he said. The words were barely louder than breath. "Hollow Creek, sir. Everyone says it there. It's just the way we greet. It's what we say to our elders. It doesn't mean anything improper. I promise you. I didn't mean—" "Who taught it to you?" She stopped. The question wasn't angry. It was desperate, and that was worse. "My grandmother, sir," she said. "Margaret Elise Harper. She said her mother taught it to her and her mother before that. She said it was the old way of greeting, the old Creek way." His hand tightened on the edge of the desk. She watched his knuckles go to bone. "Margaret," he said. Just that. Like the name itself was the whole of it. The door opened behind her, and Eliza turned without thinking. A reflex, a desperate need to not be alone in this room with what was happening. And Nathaniel Van Dorn stood in the doorway. He was already dressed for the day coat, straight jaw set. He looked at her first, a brief reflexive assessment. Then he looked at his father, and something in his face changed. The careful blankness he kept as a default cracked just slightly at the corner of his eye. "Father," he said. "Even. Careful. I didn't know you were up." Samuel Van Dorn said nothing. He was still looking at Eliza. "Sir." Nathaniel said quieter, now taking a step into the room. "Father?" "She's from Hollow Creek," the old man said. Nathaniel went still. Eliza watched him take the information and do something complicated with it behind his face, and then his eyes came back to her, and this time they were different. Not angry, not warm, something she couldn't name yet that lived between the two. "Is that right?" he said. Not quite a question. "Yes, sir," Eliza said. Her voice was steady, which surprised her. "I was just finishing up. I'll get out of your way. I didn't mean to disturb. I didn't know he was coming in. I'm sorry." "She said it," Samuel said. He still hadn't moved. "She said the greeting." Nathaniel's jaw worked. He crossed to his father in 4 quiet steps and put one hand briefly, barely against the older man's shoulder. "Come sit down," he said. "She said it exactly how Margaret used to say it." "I know." Nathaniel's voice had dropped so low that Eliza almost couldn't hear it. "Come sit down, father." Eliza pressed herself against the wall near the door, the ash bucket still in her hand, trying to figure out if she should leave, or if leaving without being dismissed would be worse. She looked from one man to the other. Samuel allowed himself to be guided to the chair. He sat. And for the first time, he looked every one of his 71 years. He looked at Eliza once more, and she held the gaze because she didn't know what else to do, because looking away felt like the wrong thing, because whatever this was, she'd been the one to start it, and the least she could do was not flinch from it now. "What is your name?" he asked. "Eliza Harper, sir." "Harper," he repeated. Something moved across his face. "Margaret Elise Harper." "That was my grandmother, sir." He looked away from her then, out the window. His hand rested open on his knee palm, up like something had been taken from it. Nathaniel turned to look at her. The expression on his face was careful and unreadable. But his voice when he spoke was even and precise. "You may go, Miss Harper." She went. In the corridor, she stood with her back against the cool plaster wall and breathed. Just breathed. She didn't fully understand what had happened. She understood enough that she had said something that shattered the composure of the most powerful man in that house, that whatever she'd cracked open was old and deep and had been waiting a very long time to break through the surface. She understood that the name Margaret meant something that everyone in that household except her already knew, and that she had walked into the middle of it without a map. She also understood this came to her slowly, the way cold comes when you've stopped moving, that her grandmother had had a secret. Maybe several. And that Hollow Creek was not as distant from the Van Dorn name as Eliza had been raised to believe. She straightened her back, picked up her ash bucket, walked toward the servants' corridor. She was halfway there when Mrs. Whitmore appeared around the corner, all efficiency and sharp edges, and stopped dead at the look on Eliza's face. "What happened?" she asked. Eliza considered telling her. Considered all of it, the greeting, the old man's face, the name he'd said, with his hand braced on the desk, like it was the only solid thing left. "Nothing," she said. "I was just finishing up in the East study." Mrs. Whitmore's eyes narrowed. "The elder Mr. Van Dorn wasn't. He came in while I was working, yes, ma'am." A pause. The housekeeper looked at her the way a woman looks when she suspects she's not being told everything, but isn't prepared to push yet. And nothing," Eliza said, steadily. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitmore." She walked on. She could feel the older woman's eyes on her back until she turned the corner. Then she exhaled long and slow and allowed herself one full moment of shaking before she pressed it down, packed it away, and went on about her day. Because Harper women didn't break promises, and whatever secret her grandmother had carried, whatever thread connected Hollow Creek to the Van Dorn name, to the grief in that old man's eyes, to the careful fractured attention of his son Eliza, intended to find the end of it. Even if pulling on it brought the whole house down. By noon, the whole servants' quarters knew something had happened in the East Wing study. Eliza hadn't said a word. She'd gone straight from the corridor to the linen closet to the second-floor hallway, and kept her head down and her hands moving the way her mother had taught her, when in doubt, work harder than anyone can criticize. But Dolly had been carrying trays near the east corridor that morning, and Dolly had ears like a hunting dog, and by the time the midday meal was on the table, the whispers had already done 2 full laps around the kitchen. "Is it true you spoke to him?" Dolly asked, leaning in close the moment Eliza sat down. "I was in the study when he came in," Eliza said. "It wasn't a conversation." "Ruth says you made him go pale." "Ruth wasn't there. Ruth knows everything that happens in this house, whether she's there or not." Dolly lowered her voice. "What did you say to him?" Eliza picked up her fork. "I said good morning." That wasn't the truth and wasn't quite a lie, and she knew it, and so she suspected did Dolly. But Dolly was 18 and still believed that pressing too hard got you somewhere, and Eliza had stopped believing that when she was 12, so she kept eating and kept quiet until Dolly gave up and turned to Clara, who was sitting across from them eating bread with the focused concentration of someone who had a lot more to say than she intended to say it. "Clara," Dolly tried. "Don't," Clara said. "You know something. I know a great many things I keep to myself. You'd do well to learn the practice." Dolly sat back offended. Ruth at the end of the table didn't look up from her plate, but said, "Leave it alone, girl. There are things in this house that aren't ours to pick at." The table went quiet after that. Not an easy quiet. The kind that had weight in it. Eliza noted that. Filed it away. She was back on the second floor by mid-afternoon, changing the linens in the guest room at the far end of the hall, when she heard the footsteps. She knew by now how to read footsteps in that house, the quick efficiency of Mrs. Whitmore, the deliberate weight of Samuel Van Dorn, the measured, unhurried pace of Nathaniel, that somehow still arrived places faster than it seemed like it should. These footsteps were Nathaniel's. They stopped just outside the open doorway. She didn't look up. kept pulling the sheet straight, moving around the bed to tuck the corner. "Miss Harper? Sir?" She still didn't look up, kept her hands working. He didn't say anything immediately. She had the sense he was deciding something. Then, "I'd like to speak with you for a moment." "Of course, sir." "You can stop what you're doing." She stopped, stood up straight, turned to face him. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed. Not aggressive, just contained the way a man leans who has spent his whole life trying to take up the minimum possible space emotionally. His expression was what she was already beginning to think of as his default, still even giving nothing away. But his eyes were doing something different, something careful and searching. "This morning," he said. "Yes, sir. My father hasn't been—" He stopped, started again. "He isn't easily unsettled. You should know that." "I could see that." "What you said to him." He paused. "That greeting, where exactly does it come from?" Eliza held herself still. "Hollow Creek, sir. It's the way we greet our elders. It's been said that way as long as anyone can remember. My grandmother said, her mother said it, and her mother before her. I didn't mean any disrespect. I didn't even realize I'd said it until it was already out." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her in that careful way. "Your grandmother," he said. "What was her name?" Something tightened in Eliza's chest. She wasn't sure why. "Margaret Elise Harper, sir." If the name landed on him, he didn't show it. But something shifted. Something in his stillness changed quality. "Was she from Hollow Creek originally?" "Born and raised, same as me. She never left, not once in her life, far as I know." He nodded, slowly, like a man receiving information he wasn't sure yet what to do with. "Thank you," he said. And then, as he was turning to go, "Mrs. Whitmore will reassign your morning rotation. You won't be going back to the East Wing study." She felt the door closing before he'd even moved. "Sir." He turned back. "I wasn't trying to cause trouble," she said. "I know that doesn't undo it, but I want you to know I wasn't." He looked at her for a moment that stretched just slightly longer than professional distance required. "I know that," he said, and then he was gone. The reassignment came through Mrs. Whitmore by evening, delivered with the tight-lipped efficiency of a woman who had decided not to comment on what she didn't fully understand. Eliza was moved to the front parlor rotation, the dining room, the main hallway. Nowhere near the East Wing. She accepted this without argument. But that night, lying awake in her narrow room, with the summer heat pressing in through the single window, she turned the name over and over in her mind. Margaret Ward. That was what Samuel had said, repeated it like it meant everything. And he'd said it just after she'd told him her grandmother's name was Margaret. Margaret Elise Harper. Born Harper. Married Harper. But born what? She sat up in the dark. Her grandmother had never talked much about her own mother, about her family before Hollow Creek. It was one of those silences that Eliza had grown up accepting as part of the woman's shape, the same way you accept a scar on someone's face without asking what made it. Some things you didn't push on. You learned that early. But now she was pushing. In the quiet and the heat she was pushing. Margaret Elise Harper. What had she been before she was Harper Mamwaha? It was Ruth who told her. Not willingly, and not directly. But Ruth had been in that house for 23 years, and there are things that 23 years in a house will do to a person. It fills them up with knowledge, the way a cellar fills with preserves, sealed and stored, and not meant to be opened. But they're always there, and eventually you bump up against one of the jars. It happened 3 days after the study incident. They were in the laundry, just the two of them, and Eliza had been quiet all morning in the deliberate way she sometimes used when she wanted someone to feel comfortable enough to talk. And eventually Ruth said, without looking up from the shirt she was pressing, "She died in the winter, 1779. Eliza said nothing, kept working. "Margaret Ward," Ruth said. "The elder Mr. Van Dorn has a portrait of her. He keeps it in his study facing his desk. 40-some years, and he still keeps it there." "I didn't notice," Eliza said. Which was true. She hadn't been looking at walls. Ruth pressed the iron down. She was from Hollow Creek. That's the story. She and Samuel Van Dorn, before he was what he is now when he was young, and not yet what his family needed him to be, they were going to marry. That was the plan. Their plan. A pause. The Van Dorn family had a different plan. What happened? What always happens with families like that? Ruth didn't say it bitterly, just factually the way you state the weather. His father told him no. Margaret Ward was a Creek girl, no money, no name. The Van Dorns needed the Aldridge connection, land money, political ties. Samuel married Caroline Aldridge. Margaret Ward went back to Hollow Creek. Another pause. And then she died in that same winter. Fever, they said. She was 20 years old. The laundry room was quiet for a moment. He never stopped, Ruth said. That's the truth of it. 37 years and he never stopped. That's why the portrait is still there. Why the East Wing is the way it is. Why nobody in this house says that name. And Nathaniel knows. Ruth looked at her, then really looked at her, the kind of look that takes your full measure. Everyone who's been here long enough knows. It's not a secret exactly. It's more like something you don't bring up. The way you don't bring up a man's missing arm. It's there. You can see it's there. You just don't point at it. Eliza's hands had gone still on the linen she was folding. Margaret Ward, Margaret Harper, Margaret Elise. She said her mother taught it to her. Her grandmother's voice dry and warm, and full of something Eliza had always thought was just age. Fare thee, bright old one. It's the old Creek way. Don't let it die, girl. Some things have to be kept. Some things have to be kept. Ruth, Eliza said. Her voice was even. She was proud of that. What was Margaret Ward's mother's name? Ruth thought about it. I don't recall exactly. Samuel may have mentioned it once or twice. Something like Elise, I think. Or Eliza. The room tilted. Not physically. Everything stayed exactly where it was. The irons, the baskets, the hanging shirts, the smell of hot cotton and soap. But something inside Eliza shifted with the finality of a key turning in a lock. Elise. Her grandmother's middle name. Margaret Elise Harper. And her grandmother's mother, the woman who had taught her daughter the Hollow Creek greeting, had a name that sounded like Eliza's own. She was not a woman who cried easily. She had learned that from her mother, who had learned it from hers. But she felt something press behind her eyes in that laundry room that she had to breathe down, had to consciously refuse, had to set aside the way you set aside something fragile and go back for it later. She folded the linen, pressed the crease down flat with her palm. Thank you, Ruth, she said. Ruth turned back to her pressing. I didn't tell you anything, she said. No. Eliza agreed. You didn't. She needed to see this portrait. She knew she shouldn't. She'd been taken off the East Wing rotation specifically to prevent exactly this kind of proximity. Nathaniel Van Dorn had made that decision with the quiet precision of a man who saw several moves ahead, and she respected the intelligence of it even as she had every intention of going around it. She went before dawn on Saturday. She knew the East Wing corridor by now. She'd cleaned it enough times in that first week to know which floorboards to avoid, which latch on the study door needed to be lifted slightly before it would turn. She moved through the sleeping house with her shoes in her hand and her candle shielded, and she was in the study before the first light touched the windows. The portrait was exactly where Ruth said it would be. She held up her candle. The woman in the painting was young, perhaps 20, perhaps younger. Painted at the edge of girlhood in the plain dress of someone who hadn't needed to dress to impress anyone. Hair dark and loose at the sides. Her expression, the kind that Eliza had seen in her mother's mirror her whole life. Her own face looked back at her. Not exact, not a replica. But the bones of it, the set of the jaw, the line of the brow, the way the eyes sat slightly wide and direct close enough that Eliza's breath left her body in a single quiet rush. She stood there for a long moment. Then she heard the floorboard in the corridor. Not the study, the corridor. She turned, and she had just enough time to lower the candle before the study door opened. Nathaniel Van Dorn stood in the doorway in his shirt sleeves. No coat, no cravat, looking like a man who hadn't slept. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them spoke for one very long, very full second. Then he looked past her to the portrait, then back to her face. Something in his expression did something she hadn't seen it do before. Not cracked exactly, shifted, like a man who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time and has just felt the weight of it acknowledged. "Miss Harper," he said, quietly. "Sir?" She straightened. "I'm sorry. I'll go." "Wait." She stopped. He came into the room slow and deliberate, and he stood beside her, and he looked at the portrait, and she stood beside him and did the same. And for a moment, that was all it was. Two people looking at a painting in the early morning dark. "You see it," he said, not a question. "I see something," she said carefully. He was quiet. Then, "My father saw it the moment you walked into this house. Before the greeting, before any of it. He saw you, and he went quiet in a way I hadn't seen him go quiet in years. I thought it was just age. I thought he was tired." A pause. "I was wrong. Nathaniel?" She stopped. Her own forwardness horrified her. "I'm sorry. Sir, don't apologize for that." His voice was low and entirely without heat, just tired. "You didn't do anything wrong. You didn't ask to look like her. You didn't choose where you came from." He turned to look at her fully. "What did Ruth tell you?" She considered lying. She discarded it. "That Margaret Ward was from Hollow Creek. That your father loved her. That she died in 1779. He nodded. And I think she was my grandmother's sister," Eliza said. "Or close enough to it that the difference doesn't much matter anymore." The words landed between them and settled. He didn't refute it, didn't confirm it. He just looked at the portrait, then at her, then away the sequence of a man cataloging a thing that has turned out to be much larger than the space he'd allotted for it. "My father cried," he said, "after you left that morning. First time I've seen him cry since my mother died. First time in 3 years. He rubbed one hand across his jaw. You said 4 words to him, and he cried. I didn't mean to. I know." He turned to face her fully, and for the first time she felt the full attention of him. Not the managed version he deployed in the hallways, but the actual weight of who he was underneath it. "Miss Harper, Eliza." He stopped, corrected nothing, let the name stand. "Do you understand what this means for this house, for my father?" "I'm starting to," she said. "He's going to want to talk to you again." "Yes, sir." "I'm not certain it's wise." "With respect, sir," she said, "I'm not certain it matters whether it's wise. I think it might be necessary." He looked at her for a long measuring moment, and then, so brief she almost missed it. The ghost of something that wasn't quite a smile, but was its nearest living relative. He said, "My father said almost those exact words to me once, about something that wasn't wise. What happened?" "He did it anyway," Nathaniel said, "and he's regretted it ever since." He moved toward the door, stopped with his hand on the frame and his back to her. "Be careful, Miss Harper. Not with my father. He won't hurt you. Be careful with the rest of them, the staff, Mrs. Whitmore, anyone who's been in this house long enough to have loyalties to protect." He paused. "There are people here who will not be glad of what you've stirred up." She thought of Clara at the dinner table, the way she hadn't looked up from her plate, the practiced way she'd said both when Eliza asked who she shouldn't talk to. "I understand," she said. He left without another word. Eliza stood alone in the study and looked at the portrait for one more moment, at that young woman's face, at the Hollow Creek plain dress, at the eyes that were shaped like her own eyes. "Who were you?" she said, quietly, to no one, to the room, to the woman in the painting. The answer she suspected was going to cost her something. It always did. Zag. The something came faster than she expected. By Sunday afternoon, Clara had stopped speaking to her entirely. Not in the obvious way, not loudly, or with confrontation, but in the precise surgical way of a woman who has decided to communicate her position through the absolute withdrawal of acknowledgement. She looked through Eliza at meals. She handed off tasks at the boundary of shared duties without eye contact. She was in the language of household women who had been managing each other for centuries, furious. Dolly noticed. "What did you do to her?" she whispered. "Nothing I know of." "She's been in service here 15 years. She was here when the elder Mrs. Van Dorn was still alive." Dolly watched Clara move across the kitchen. "She's protective of things." "Of what things?" "Of the way things are," Dolly said. "She doesn't like when things change." Eliza looked at Clara. Clara happened to glance up at exactly that moment, and their eyes met, and what Eliza saw in Clara's face wasn't anger exactly. It was something older and more complicated than anger. It was the look of a woman who sees the future coming and has already decided she doesn't intend to make peace with it. "There are people here who will not be glad of what you've stirred up." She understood now what Nathaniel had meant. The message came through the butler on Monday morning, delivered with the stiffness of a man who had been given unusual instructions and wasn't sure what to make of them. "The elder Mr. Van Dorn requests your presence in the east sitting room at 2 o'clock, Miss Harper." Eliza looked up from the silver she was polishing. "I see. Mrs. Whitmore has been informed." She thought of what Nathaniel had said. "I'm not certain it's wise." She thought of what she'd said back. "I'm not certain it matters whether it's wise." "Tell him I'll be there," she said. At 5 minutes to 2, she was in the main hallway heading for the east sitting room when a hand closed briefly lightly on her elbow. She turned. Nathaniel stood there, still in his morning coat papers in his other hand, looking for all the world like a man who'd happened to be passing through. They both knew better. "You're going," he said. "Yes, sir." He looked at her for a moment, something working behind his eyes that she couldn't read. Then, "He's going to tell you things. About her. About Margaret. About the family." He kept his voice low. "Some of it is going to be difficult to hear." "I'm not easily broken." "I didn't say broken. I said difficult." He held her gaze. "There's a difference." She held his gaze right back. "Thank you for the warning, sir." He released her elbow, stepped aside, watched her walk toward the east corridor. She did not look back, but she felt him watching. She lifted her chin, steadied her breath, and she walked through the door. Samuel Van Dorn was waiting for her. He was seated in the chair by the window, not behind a desk, not positioned above her in any official way. Just an old man in a chair, with his hands folded in his lap, and the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have been carrying something heavy for so long that even the muscles of their face have learned to accommodate the weight. He looked up when she came in. "Sit down, child," he said. His voice was different from the first time, steadier, like he'd spent the last 4 days preparing for this. "Please." She sat in the chair across from him. He looked at her for a long moment. "Tell me her name again," he said. "Your grandmother." "Margaret Elise Harper," Eliza said. "Born in Hollow Creek. Died there too, 8 years ago." His breath came out slow. 8 years. "Yes, sir. I didn't know she'd lived," he said. "All this time I was told she died. In the winter of 1779. Fever." He looked at his hands. "I was told. And I believed it because I had no reason not to, and because I couldn't bear to go back there and find out otherwise." He paused. "I should have gone back." Eliza felt the world very quietly rearrange itself around her. "Sir," she said carefully, "what exactly are you telling me?" He looked up from his hands, and what she saw in his face was not the grief of a man mourning the dead. It was the grief of a man who has just discovered that the dead were never dead at all. "Margaret Ward didn't die in 1779, he said. "Your grandmother, she was Margaret Ward. She went back to Hollow Creek. She changed her name. She lived." His voice cracked clean through on the last word just once, and then held. "She lived, and she never told me, and now she's been gone 8 years, and I will never—" He stopped. The room was completely silent. Eliza sat with the weight of 37 years of grief settling onto her shoulders, like something she had not consented to carry, and had no choice but to hold. Her grandmother, Margaret Elise Harper, who had taught her the greeting, who had pressed it into her like a brand, who had said some things have to be kept with a weight in her voice that Eliza had always accepted as wisdom, and was now beginning to understand as something else entirely. Some things have to be kept. Not some things have to be remembered. Some things have to be kept. "She knew," Eliza said. The words came out barely above a breath. Samuel Van Dorn closed his eyes. "Yes," he said. "I believe she did." She knew. Those 2 words followed Eliza out of the east sitting room and down the corridor and into the rest of her day like something tied to her ankle. She moved through her afternoon tasks the way you move through water, everything slower, heavier, requiring more effort than it should. She changed linens. She carried trays. She answered when spoken to and asked nothing when she wasn't, and all the while those 2 words kept turning themselves over inside her chest. She knew. Her grandmother had known Samuel Van Dorn was alive. Had known he was out there, married, settled, powerful, the name that people in Hollow Creek said, the way they said weather and God and winter. Had known and had said nothing. Had taken the secret with her when the fever finally caught her 8 years ago, leaving behind a granddaughter and a worn leather Bible and a greeting nobody else in the world seemed to use anymore. "Fare thee bright, old one. Don't let it die, girl. Some things have to be kept." Eliza set down the tray she was carrying, harder than she meant to, and the dishes rattled, and she stood still for a moment, with her hands pressed flat on the table, and her eyes closed, and breathed. She had spent 22 years believing her grandmother was a plain good woman from a plain small town who had lived a quiet life and asked for nothing more than what she had. And now that woman had become someone else entirely, someone with a past that reached all the way to New York, all the way to this house, all the way to an old man in a chair who had spent 37 years mourning her as dead. Why? That was what Eliza couldn't find the floor of. Why keep that silence? Why never reach back? If she'd known he was there, why had she let him believe she was gone? She didn't have an answer. And the not having felt like standing on a bridge with one board missing everything else solid, but the one place she needed to step, nothing there at all. Clara was waiting for her in the servants' corridor, not pacing, not anxious, just waiting the way a woman waits when she has made a decision and is simply allowing time to catch up to it. She was standing with her arms folded and her back straight, and when Eliza came around the corner, she didn't move aside. "I need to speak with you," Clara said. "All right." "Not here." Clara's eyes moved to the doorway behind Eliza, then back. "Walk with me." They went to the end of the corridor where the linen storage sat dark and unused at this hour. Clara pushed the door partway open and they stood in the half-dark, and Eliza waited because she'd learned a long time ago that the person who speaks first in a conversation like this is usually the person who needs it more. Clara looked at her for a long moment. Then, "What did he tell you?" "That's between Mr. Van Dorn and me." "Don't." Clara's voice cut low and sharp. "Don't do that. You've been in this house 2 weeks and you've already undone more than you know. Don't pretend you're being careful when you're standing in the middle of a fire." Eliza looked at her evenly. "What exactly do you think I've done, Clara? You've given that old man something to hope for." Clara said it like it was an accusation. And hope is the most dangerous thing you can give a man who's spent 40 years learning to live without it. When it doesn't hold, when you leave, when this passes, when reality sets back in, it won't just hurt him. It will finish him. Eliza was quiet for a moment. Then, "How long have you been in this house?" Clara's jaw tightened. 15 years. And before that, a beat. I came with Mrs. Van Dorn, the late Mrs. Van Dorn, Caroline. She said the name like a person says the name of someone they've made a promise to. I was her maid for 11 years before we came here. I've been here since. There it was. Eliza felt it click into place the way a drawer finds its groove. Clara wasn't protecting the house. She wasn't protecting Samuel or Nathaniel or the order of things. She was protecting Caroline. You were loyal to her, Eliza said. She was a good woman. I don't doubt it. Then you understand, Clara said. The sharpness in her voice had shifted to something more brittle, more careful. What she built here, the life she made for this family, what she gave Nathaniel, what she gave this house, it doesn't deserve to be torn apart by... She stopped. By someone like me. Eliza said it without heat. Clara looked away. I was going to say by the past. The past didn't come here looking for trouble, Eliza said. I came here looking for work. Everything else walked in on its own. Clara turned back. Her eyes were hard and steady, and underneath them was something that looked, if Eliza was reading it right, a great deal like fear. You need to be very careful, she said, about what you ask, about what you look for. There are things in this house that were put to rest for good reason. By whom? Clara didn't answer. Clara. Eliza kept her voice low and direct. By whom? The older woman looked at her for one more moment. Then she turned and walked away. Eliza went to Ruth. She didn't have a better option. She trusted Ruth the way you trust a deep-rooted tree, not because the tree has done anything for you personally, but because you can feel that it's been standing a long time and knows what weather is. Clara was Caroline Van Dorn's personal maid before she came here, Eliza said. Ruth was mending a shirt by the window. She didn't look up. That's right. And she's protective of Caroline's memory. Very. Why? What would need protecting? Ruth's needle went still. Then it started moving again, slow and deliberate. There are things I know because I've been here a long time, she said. And there are things I know because I've kept my eyes open and my mouth shut, which is the only sensible way to work in a house like this. Ruth. The needle stopped again. Ruth set the shirt down in her lap and looked out the window at nothing in particular, and something crossed her face, the expression of a person deciding whether the truth is finally less costly than the silence. Caroline Van Dorn knew, Ruth said, about Margaret Ward. She knew the whole time. Eliza went very still. She knew Samuel had loved her. She knew more than that. Ruth folded her hands over the shirt. I heard it once years ago from the old butler before he retired. He'd been with the family since before Samuel married. He said... She stopped, pressed her lips together. He said that in the winter of 1779, when Margaret Ward went back to Hollow Creek, she didn't go because she gave up. She went because she received a letter that told her Samuel had chosen his family's match, that he was marrying Caroline Aldridge and asking Margaret to release him from any understanding between them. Eliza felt the room shift. Did Samuel write that letter? Ruth looked at her directly. The old butler didn't believe so. The silence between them had the weight of something enormous and old. He believed Caroline wrote it, Ruth said, or had it written. She was determined to have the match. The Van Dorn family needed the Aldridge land, and Caroline Aldridge wanted Samuel Van Dorn, and Margaret Ward was in the way. She paused. And after Margaret went after Samuel, was told she'd died, there was no reason to think otherwise. Caroline married him. She was a good wife to him. She gave him Nathaniel. She ran this house well. Another pause. She just built all of it on something that wasn't hers to take. Eliza sat with that. Her grandmother hadn't kept the secret out of pride, hadn't chosen silence out of bitterness or spite. She had been made to believe that Samuel had sent her away himself, that he had chosen, that she was not wanted. And Samuel had spent 37 years mourning a woman who had lived the whole time with the quiet wound of believing she'd been abandoned. Two people. Two separate sealed-off griefs. Neither one knowing the other was still there. Is there proof, Eliza said, of the letter, of what Caroline did? Ruth was quiet. Ruth. There are things that were put in the East Wing, Ruth said slowly. When Caroline died, Nathaniel boxed up her personal correspondence. He hasn't opened those boxes. He put them in the room at the end of the East Corridor and locked the door, and as far as I know, the key's been sitting in his desk drawer ever since. She looked at Eliza with the careful eyes of a woman who is not quite telling you to do something, and is not quite not telling you either. He hasn't had cause to go back in. Eliza stood up. Eliza? Ruth's voice came quiet and level. Whatever you find in there, think carefully before you use it. Truth has a way of costing more than you budgeted. I know, Eliza said. Do you? She did. She just wasn't sure it changed anything. She didn't go that night. She made herself wait, which was one of the harder things she'd done in recent memory because the waiting sat in her stomach like a stone, and every hour it grew heavier. She waited because rushing had a way of making noise, and noise had a way of alerting Clara, and Clara was already watching her with the focused attention of a woman who has identified a threat and is deciding what to do about it. She waited until the following morning when the household's rhythms were at their most predictable. Nathaniel in the front study with his correspondence. Samuel still at his morning meal. Mrs. Whitmore occupied with the weekly delivery accounts Clara assigned to the upper guest rooms. She had 20 minutes, maybe less. The key was where Ruth had said it would be, in the shallow left drawer of Nathaniel's desk, beneath a folded document she didn't look at. She took it. She moved through the East Corridor, and she unlocked the room at the end, and she stepped inside. The boxes were stacked against the far wall, 4 of them sealed with plain cord. She went to the one on top, unknotted the cord, lifted the lid. Letters, dozens of them. Caroline Van Dorn's handwriting. She'd seen it on the household records, a precise compressed script that moved in perfectly straight lines across the page. Personal correspondence invitations, social notes. She moved through them fast, not reading, looking for something older. Something from before the marriage, something from 1779. She found it at the bottom of the 3rd box. Not a letter to Samuel, not anything addressed to Hollow Creek. It was addressed to Caroline herself, to Miss Caroline Aldridge at the Aldridge family estate, and it was written in a hand Eliza didn't recognize in the terse clipped sentences of a man who was used to conducting business, and had applied that efficiency to a task that had nothing businesslike about it at all. The matter has been handled as you requested. The ward girl has received her correspondence and departed. She will not be returning. I trust this concludes our arrangement. Please ensure payment is delivered through the usual means and not through any channel that might occasion questions. It was not signed with a full name, just initials. R.T. Eliza read it twice, then a 3rd time. She was not a woman who needed to read something 4 times to understand it, but she was a woman who needed to be sure, who needed to look at a thing long enough to be certain that what she was seeing was what was actually there, and not something she'd put there herself. It was there. Caroline Aldridge had paid someone to write that letter, to tell Margaret Ward that Samuel was releasing her, to send her away, and then to keep it quiet. Eliza folded the letter, pressed it flat against her palm. Then she heard Clara in the doorway. She turned. Clara was standing very still, looking at the letter in Eliza's hand, and the fear that Eliza had glimpsed in her the night before was no longer a glimpse. It was fully present and fully terrible, the fear of a woman who has been keeping a wall standing by sheer force of will and has just watched someone pull out the cornerstone. "Give me that," Clara said. "No. Eliza." She took a step into the room. "You don't understand what you're doing. If that goes to Samuel, if Nathaniel sees it, do you know what it will do to this family? To Nathaniel's memory of his mother? She's been dead 3 years. She can't defend herself. She can't explain herself. You'll take everything he has left of her and make it into—" "I'll make it into the truth," Eliza said. "The truth." Clara said it like the word was a blunt instrument. The truth that his mother arranged a lie to secure a marriage 40 years ago. That's the truth you want to give him? "It's not mine to give or withhold," Eliza said. "It exists. Whether I hold on to it or hand it over doesn't make it less true." Clara crossed the room in 3 fast steps and reached for the letter, and Eliza stepped back and held it out of reach, and for one strange, still moment, they stood there. 2 women in a locked room between a wall of stacked boxes, one holding something the other needed desperately, and neither of them breathed. "Please," Clara said. The word came out cracked, not pleading exactly, more like the last attempt at an argument that has run out of other options. She was a good woman. She wasn't cruel. She did what she thought she had to do, and she spent 40 years making this household into something real and good, and Nathaniel... Her voice broke just slightly. Nathaniel loves her. He still talks to her portrait. He keeps flowers on her grave every spring. Don't take that from him. Eliza looked at her. At the real fear in her. At the grief underneath it, because that was there too genuine and old. The grief of a woman who had given 15 years of her best loyalty to a family and couldn't bear to see the foundation of it give way. "I'm not doing this to hurt Nathaniel," Eliza said, "or to punish Caroline, or to punish you." She kept her voice even. "But there's an old man in this house who has believed for 37 years that the woman he loved died. That's 37 years of grief built on a lie. He deserves to know that she lived, that she didn't choose to leave him, that she was sent away against her will." She paused. "Whether you like what comes next or not, Clara, he deserves that much." Clara stood there. Then she took 1 step back, then another. Her arms came unfolded and hung at her sides, and she looked suddenly like a woman who has been standing for a very long time and has just sat down inside herself. She didn't say anything else. She walked out of the room. Eliza waited. Then she smoothed the letter in her hands, tucked it against her waist, and followed. She went to Nathaniel first. She'd thought about it on the walk from the east corridor, and she'd decided that was the right order. Not Samuel, not yet. Because Samuel was 71 years old and had already absorbed more in 5 days than most men survived in a decade. And what was in that letter was going to hit him in a place he had very little armor left. If she went to him first alone without Nathaniel knowing if anything happened, she went to Nathaniel. He was at his desk when she knocked and entered. He looked up, registered her face, and put down his pen. He didn't say anything. He just waited. He'd developed, she had noticed a gift for waiting when something in her expression told him that speaking first would not be useful. She crossed the room and placed the letter on the desk in front of him. He looked at it, then at her. Then he picked it up. She watched him read it. Watched the stillness of his face hold and hold and hold, the way ice holds on a river in early spring. You can see the pressure building underneath, and you wait, and you wait, and you know the moment before it happens. He set the letter down. He looked at the wall for a moment, then at the letter again, then at nothing. "Nathaniel," she said, and neither of them acknowledged the name this time. It just fit the room. "Where did you find this?" His voice was perfectly controlled. The control of it told her more than volume would have. "In the boxes of your mother's correspondence, the room at the end of the east corridor. You had the key. I borrowed it from your desk. I'll return it." He looked at her. A long, measured look. "You went into my mother's things." "Yes." "Without asking." "Yes." He was quiet. Then, "Why didn't you ask?" "Because you would have said no." "You don't know that." "I know you're a man who doesn't open boxes," she said. "And I know why. And I know you would have needed more reason than I could have given you to open those specific ones." She kept her voice steady. "I found the reason after." He looked back at the letter. His jaw was working. Not anger, she'd come to understand the difference in him by now. This was the expression he made when he was holding something down that didn't want to be held. "She was 22 years old," he said. "My mother when this was done. 22. A pause. "Same age as you?" Eliza said nothing. She wanted the match badly enough to... He stopped, started again. "My father never looked at her the way she wanted to be looked at." "I know that. I've always known that. There was always something held back, some part of him she could never reach. She used to say..." He stopped again. His hand came up and pressed once flat against the desk. She used to say she hoped someday he'd look at her the way he looked at the portrait. The words landed hard. She knew about the portrait, Eliza said. She always knew. He was quiet for a moment. She put it in his study herself, said she wouldn't live in a house with a ghost in it, and she'd rather give the ghost a room than have it wandering the hallways. He laughed once short and humorless. That's who she was. She was... He stopped. She was a complicated woman. Most people are, Eliza said. He looked at her. And what she saw in his face was the expression of a man standing in the wreckage of a specific kind of love. Not romantic love, but filial love. The love that a child has for a parent, which is among the most entangled kinds. There is because it is built so early that it becomes part of the architecture of who you are, and when it shifts, everything built on top of it shifts too. He has to know, Eliza said. I know. Not just about the letter. All of it. That Margaret lived. That my grandmother was... I know. Nathaniel said again. He picked up the letter, set it down, picked it up again. I'll tell him. Nathaniel. She stopped. I think it should be me. He'll take it differently from me. She paused. I'm the one who looks like her. And I think that's why my grandmother taught me the greeting. I think she always knew somewhere in herself that this might find him. That something might find him. A pause. I think she wanted him to know that she hadn't chosen to go. The silence in the room was full and heavy and not ungentle. Nathaniel looked at her for a long time. Then he said, She raised you. Yes. She put her hands on you, taught you her words, sent you out into the world with her face and her voice, and the one thing she knew would reach him if you ever ended up in the same room. He said it quietly, not accusatory, just looking at it. That's not chance, Eliza. No, she agreed. I don't think it was. Something shifted in the air between them. Something that had been building since the morning in the study, when he'd stood beside her, looking at the portrait, since the corridor, when his hand had touched her elbow, since every careful, controlled interaction that had been exactly what it needed to be on the surface, and considerably more than that underneath. She felt it. She thought he felt it too. Neither of them named it. This was not the moment for that. I'll take you to him, Nathaniel said. He rose from the desk, and he folded the letter and put it in his coat pocket, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who has just made a decision he knows will cost him, and has made it anyway. And I'll stay. Whatever he needs, I'll stay. They walked to the East Wing together. Samuel Van Dorn looked up when the door opened and both of them came through it. He looked from his son to Eliza and back, and something in the set of his face said that he had been expecting something that a man who had lived with weight long enough could feel when the next weight was coming. Sit down, Father, Nathaniel said. I'd rather stand. Please sit down. Samuel sat. He looked at Eliza. What is it, child? Eliza stepped forward. She'd carried harder things than this before. She had stood at her mother's bedside in the last hours. She had spoken at her grandmother's grave with her voice entirely steady, because someone had to be, and she was the only one left. She knew how to carry. She sat across from him, looked at him directly. My grandmother didn't leave because she wanted to, she said. She left because she received a letter that told her you had chosen to release her. That you were marrying Caroline Aldridge and asking her to go. She paused. She believed that letter. She believed it her whole life. Samuel's hands went still in his lap. She didn't die in 1779, Eliza said. And she didn't leave because she gave up on you. She left because she was made to believe that you had given up on her. Samuel Van Dorn looked at his son. Nathaniel reached into his coat pocket and placed the letter on the side table beside him. The old man picked it up. He read it slowly, and she could see watching his face the precise moment that the truth went in. Not the shock of it. Something quieter and more devastating than shock. The look of a man watching 37 years reorganize themselves into a shape he had never imagined they could take. When he set it down, his eyes were dry. Eliza had expected tears. What she saw instead was something older than tears, the expression of a man on the far side of grief, where even the weeping has been used up, and what's left is just the bare fact of what happened, stripped of everything that once softened it. He said nothing for a very long time. Then he said, "She kept the greeting." "Yes," Eliza said. "She taught it to you. She taught it to my mother first, and my mother to me. She said not to let it die." Samuel Van Dorn closed his eyes. When he opened them, he looked at his son. And Nathaniel, who had been standing with his back against the wall with the careful stillness of a man trying to give space to something larger than himself, looked back at his father, and neither of them said a word. But something passed between them that Eliza understood without understanding, the specific language of two people who love each other, and have just had the ground shift under them together. Then Samuel looked at Eliza. "She lived a good life," he said. "She did," Eliza said. "She had people who loved her. She had her town. She had her garden. She died in her own bed at peace." She held his gaze. "She kept your name out of it, but she kept the greeting. I think—" She stopped. "I think that was for you. I think she kept it because she wanted something of herself to find you, even if she couldn't." He didn't say anything. He put his hand out flat on the table beside him, and Eliza reached over without thinking and placed her own hand on top of it. The way you hold a hand that needs holding. The way her grandmother had held hers once at a graveside without saying a word about it afterward. They sat like that for a moment, and outside the door in the corridor, Nathaniel Van Dorn stood with his back against the wall, and his eyes closed, and breathed long and slow, the breath of a man who has just watched something be laid to rest, that has been restless for longer than he's been alive. And in the quiet of that house, in the summer of 1815, something finally settled. But settling, Eliza knew, was not the same as finished, because the letter was real. And the question of what to do with it, with Caroline's name, with Nathaniel's inheritance of it, with the household that had been built on a foundation that had just cracked straight through that question, was very much still alive. And it would not wait much longer for an answer. The morning after was quiet in the way that only mornings after something enormous can be quiet, not peaceful, but exhausted. The kind of quiet that a house makes when it has absorbed more than it expected to and is still trying to figure out where to put it all. Eliza was up before the others. She dressed in the dark and went down to the kitchen and put the kettle on and stood with her hands wrapped around her own elbows and waited for the water to boil, which was something her mother had always done when things were too large to think about directly. You didn't think about the large thing. You thought about the kettle. You thought about the water. You stayed inside the small, manageable task until the large thing settled enough to be approached. She was still standing like that when Dolly came in sleepy-eyed and stopped at the sight of her. "You're up early," Dolly said. "Couldn't sleep." Dolly moved to the bread without asking anything further, which was unusual for her, and Eliza noticed it. Noticed the careful way the younger woman set about her work, the deliberate not asking, the not looking. Word had gotten around. It always did in houses like this. She didn't know exactly how much word, or what shape it had taken by the time it reached the rest of the staff, but enough. Enough that even Dolly, who had a question for everything, was keeping her mouth shut this morning. Mrs. Whitmore came down at 6:15. She poured her own tea and stood by the window and didn't speak for a long moment. Eliza waited. "Clara gave notice last night," Mrs. Whitmore said finally. Eliza looked at her. "I see. She'll be gone by end of week." The housekeeper's voice carried none of its usual precision. It was flat like a road after the rain. 15 years. I've never known her to leave a post." She looked at Eliza directly. "Are you going to tell me what happened?" "I think you already know the outline of it," Eliza said. "I know the outline. I want to know if you're sorry for any of it." Eliza thought about that with the seriousness it deserved. "I'm sorry for the parts that hurt people who didn't deserve hurting," she said. I'm not sorry for the truth being out." Mrs. Whitmore looked at her for a long moment. Then she turned back to the window. "Neither am I," she said very quietly. "Though I suspect it's going to be a complicated few weeks." She finished her tea and went about her day, and Eliza understood that was as close to absolution as she was likely to get from that quarter, and it was enough. She didn't see Samuel at breakfast. Ruth said he'd asked for a tray in his rooms, which was not unusual, but the quality of the not unusual felt different this morning, like a man who needed the walls close around him while he did something internal that required privacy. She didn't push. She let him have the morning. It was Nathaniel she found first mid-morning, standing in the corridor outside his mother's portrait. She almost didn't stop. She'd been carrying clean linens to the upper rooms, and the corridor was on her route, and she came around the corner. And there he was, just standing, looking at the portrait, his hands at his sides, his expression doing something she'd never seen it do before. Not blank, not controlled. Open in the way that faces are open when they forget anyone might be watching. She slowed. She should have kept walking. She didn't. He heard her and turned, and for a moment neither of them moved to cover the moment with politeness. "She's still her," he said. Not to anyone in particular, just out loud. "Whatever she did, she's still who raised me. She's still the one who sat with me when I was sick, who read to me, who told me how to be a man." He looked back at the portrait. "I don't know how to hold both things." "You don't have to decide how to hold them today," Eliza said. "No," he agreed. "But eventually," she kept her voice gentle. "Most people who do something they shouldn't, they're not monsters. They're just people who wanted something badly enough to make a choice they couldn't take back." She paused. "Your mother wanted your father. She wanted the life she built here. She wanted you." A beat. "That doesn't make it right, but it makes it human." He looked at her for a moment. Then, "You're very generous to her considering what she cost your family." "She cost me nothing I knew I had," Eliza said. "She cost your father 37 years, and my grandmother a life she should have been able to choose for herself." She let that sit. "Those are the people I'm thinking about, not myself." He turned to face her fully. The expression on his face was something she'd come to recognize as his version of unguarded, still composed, still controlled, but with the real thing underneath, showing through the way light shows through gauze. "Thank you," he said, "for going into those boxes, for not letting it stay buried." "Someone had to." "You could have left it alone," he said. "You'd been here 2 weeks. You had no obligation to any of this." "I had my grandmother's name," Eliza said. That felt like obligation enough. He was quiet for a moment. Then, as if the words cost him something to say, "She would have liked you, my mother. She had a very specific respect for women who didn't back down." He half turned back to the portrait. "She'd have probably found you infuriating." Eliza almost smiled. "I can live with that." He made a sound that was the nearest she'd heard from him to a laugh. Not quite there, but close. Then he straightened, collected himself back into the shape he wore in the daytime, and said, "My father wants to see you. This afternoon, if you're willing." "Of course." "He has something for you," Nathaniel said. "He didn't tell me what. Only that it was long past time." Long past time turned out to be 37 years past time. She went to the east sitting room at 2 o'clock, same as before, and Samuel Van Dorn was in the same chair, same posture, but different in the way that a man is different when he's made a decision. There was a quality of resolution in him that hadn't been there yesterday. Not peace, exactly. More like the feeling of a man who has set down something very heavy and is still getting used to his own hands. He had an envelope in his lap. She sat. He looked at her. He looked at the envelope. "I wrote this 37 years ago," he said. "The night before my wedding to Caroline." He held it out to her. She took it. The envelope was old yellow at the edges, the seal long since pressed flat and dried, and it was addressed in a younger version of Samuel Van Dorn's handwriting to Miss Margaret E. Ward, Hollow Creek, Massachusetts. It had never been sent. The seal had never been broken. "I wrote it as a farewell," he said. "I thought she was dead. I thought—" He stopped. "I wrote it anyway. Some things you say even when there's no one to hear them. Maybe especially then." He folded his hands in his lap. "I want you to have it. It was meant for her. I can't give it to her now, but I can give it to the person she left behind." "Do you want me to read it?" Eliza asked. "Yes," he said. "I want someone who loved her to know what I said." Her hands were steady when she opened it. She was proud of that. The letter was 3 pages. The handwriting was cramped and uneven in places, the writing of a man working against emotion rather than with it. She read it slowly, and she did not look up, and she did not let her face do what it wanted to do, because Samuel Van Dorn was watching, and she owed him something steadier than her own grief right now. It was a love letter. That was the only word for it, not romantic in any flowery or decorated way, but in the way that real love is real, specific, plain-spoken, full of the small, particular things that no one else would know to mention. He wrote about her laugh, the way she said the greeting, the way she argued about everything with the focused energy of someone who cared deeply about being right, but cared more about being honest. He wrote about the morning he'd known standing in her mother's kitchen in Hollow Creek, watching her argue with her sister about whether the bread was ready, that he was going to love her for the rest of his life, which he understood even then was likely to be inconvenient. He wrote that he was sorry, not with the easy sorry of a man seeking absolution, but with the specific, detailed sorry of a man cataloging exactly what he was sorry for line by line, because he believed she deserved to know precisely what he understood, himself to have failed at, even if she would never read it. He wrote at the end, "I will keep your greeting. I will say it to myself in the evenings when the house is quiet, and I need to remember that I was once someone who knew how to say it. Fare thee bright, Margaret. Wherever you are, fare thee bright." Eliza folded the letter back along its original creases and placed it carefully in the envelope and held it in both hands. She breathed in. Out. "She kept the greeting too," she said. Her voice held. Just barely, but it held. "She taught it to everyone in that house. Said it was the old Creek way. Said it had to be kept." She looked at him. "I think she was keeping it for the same reason you were." Samuel Van Dorn's eyes were very bright. He did not look away from her. "She loved you," Eliza said. "She didn't leave because she stopped. I need you to know that. Whatever she believed, whatever that letter made her think, you'd decided she kept every piece of you that she could hold on to. The greeting, the way you talked about Hollow Creek, the name." She paused. "My middle name is Elise. Her middle name was Elise. I always thought it was just a family name. Now I think maybe she was keeping a piece of the woman she was before she left too." He looked at her for a long moment. "You look like her," he said. "Not just the face, the way you stand, the way you don't look away when something is hard." He smiled, and it was the first real smile she'd seen from him. Not wide, not easy, but genuine, the kind that costs something. "She would have driven me absolutely mad, you know, in the best possible way." Eliza smiled back. "I've been told I have that effect." He laughed, actually laughed low and rusty with disuse, like a door that hasn't been opened in a long time but real. And the sound of it did something to the room, made it smaller and warmer and more human than it had felt since she'd arrived. Then the door opened, and the warmth didn't leave exactly, but it rearranged itself. The man who walked in was not Nathaniel. He was perhaps 50, broad-shouldered, with the manner of someone who was accustomed to entering rooms and having them orient toward him. Eliza had not seen him before, but she saw from the way Samuel's expression shifted, not afraid, but braced, that this was not a welcome interruption. "Cousin Edward," Samuel said. "Samuel!" The man's eyes moved to Eliza. They stayed there a moment longer than necessary. "I heard you had a new situation here. I thought I'd call." "You might have written first." "I was in the area." He crossed the room and sat down without being invited, which told Eliza everything she needed to know about the family dynamics at play. He looked at her again, openly assessing. "This is the girl, then. the maid from Massachusetts. "Miss Harper is a member of my household staff," Samuel said. His voice had gone to iron. "You'll address her accordingly." Edward smiled in the way men smile when they've heard something they intend to ignore. "Of course." He turned his attention back to Samuel. "The family has heard some interesting things these past few days, Samuel. You know how servants talk." "I know how you listen," Samuel said. "You're not well." Edward said it with a sympathy that didn't reach his eyes. "That's what people are saying. That this business with the Ward girl's granddaughter has brought up things better left alone. There's talk of some kind of formal acknowledgement, some legal recognition of—" "There is no such talk," Samuel said flatly. Edward paused. "No, not from me." A beat. Then from Nathaniel. "Nathaniel has nothing to do with this conversation." Eliza sat very still. She could feel Edward's attention returning to her like the heat from a lamp that was pointed just slightly wrong. Not comfortable, not welcome. He was calculating. That was the word for what was happening behind his eyes. He was adding up what he saw and deciding what it might cost him. "The Van Dorn estate has interests," Edward said carefully. "The family has relationships. A maid from Massachusetts who's managed to get the ear of the elder Van Dorn and spend private time with the heir regardless of the circumstances creates a certain kind of conversation that the family name doesn't need." "Edward." Samuel's voice was quiet and absolutely final. "You will leave this house today. You will not return without an invitation, and you will tell whoever sent you, because I know you didn't come here on your own initiative, you never have, that this family's affairs are this family's affairs, and that hasn't changed." Edward looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at Eliza. Then he stood. "I hope you know what you're inviting," he said. To Samuel. But he was looking at Eliza. "I know exactly what I'm inviting," Samuel said. "Good day, Edward." The man left. The door closed. The room breathed. Eliza turned to Samuel. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to bring that kind of attention." "You didn't bring it. It's always been there." Samuel waved a hand. "Edward has been circling this estate for 20 years waiting for something he can use. He won't find it." He looked at her steadily. "You have nothing to apologize for." But she'd seen Edward's eyes. And she knew in the way her mother had taught her to know things in the practical, unsentimental knowledge of women who understood that the world was not always arranged in their favor, that he wouldn't leave this alone. That whatever he'd heard, whatever he suspected, he would carry it back to wherever he'd come from and tend it carefully and wait. She tucked that away, for later. Nathaniel found her in the corridor on her way back to her duties. He fell into step beside her without preamble. "I saw Edward leave," he said. "He didn't stay long. He never does. He comes to gather information, and then he retreats to whatever corner he operates from." He paused. "What did he say to you?" "Mostly he talked to your father. But he made sure I understood that my presence here is being noted." She kept walking. "He mentioned legal recognition. Said there was family talk of it." Nathaniel's pace slowed slightly. "That wasn't my father's intention. He hasn't spoken to anyone about that." "Someone has." She glanced at him. "Has your father spoken to his lawyer recently?" A pause that told her the answer. "Nathaniel, he sent a letter 3 days ago," Nathaniel said quietly. Before everything with the letter from my mother. He was asking about the implications of acknowledging a family connection, a formal one." He paused. "I didn't know until yesterday." Eliza stopped walking. She turned to face him. And she looked at him long enough to see what the situation actually was. Nathaniel, who had just been handed the knowledge that his mother had done something irreparable, who was simultaneously trying to grieve that and protect her legacy, was now also dealing with the prospect of his father making a legal move that would make it all public. "You're afraid of what happens if this goes legal," she said. "I'm afraid of what happens to my mother's name," he said, plainly. No defensiveness in it, just the truth stated as cleanly as he could state it. "If my father files anything with a lawyer, it requires explanation. The explanation requires the letter. The letter means my mother's name becomes part of a legal record. What she did becomes... He stopped. Not just family knowledge. Public knowledge. I understand, Eliza said. Do you think I'm wrong? She thought about it. Really thought about it the way the question deserved. No, she said. I think you're trying to protect someone you love from consequences she can no longer face. I think that's human. She paused. I also think your father has been carrying this for 37 years, and he needs to put it somewhere real. He needs to acknowledge it not for the law, but for himself. Those two things aren't the same. No, she agreed. They're not. And that's the conversation you need to have with him. He looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his expression that she was beginning to understand was his version of trust, not easy, not given quickly, but genuine when it appeared. Would you be there? He said. When you talk to him? Yes. She considered it. Only if he asks for me. It's between you. He nodded. Then quieter. He likes you very much, you know, my father. He's called you brave twice in conversation, and he doesn't use that word lightly. He barely knows me. He knows enough. Nathaniel looked at her with the particular steadiness of a man choosing his words carefully. He said you reminded him that some things that were put away a long time ago still deserve to be said out loud. She didn't answer that. There wasn't a safe answer to that, not here, not yet. Not while the rest of the house was still resettling. She turned back toward the hallway and kept walking. After a moment, he walked with her. Conk. The conversation between Nathaniel and his father, she did not witness it, and she did not ask after it. She gave them the rest of the afternoon and the evening, and she did her work, and she waited. Ruth told her what she could piece together from the aftermath. That Nathaniel had gone to his father mid-afternoon, and they'd been behind a closed door for the better part of 2 hours. That when Nathaniel came out, he'd looked like a man who had set something down and was figuring out how to walk without it. That Samuel had eaten supper in the dining room for the first time in a week, had sat at the head of his table and eaten in the company of his household and not retreated to his rooms. She took that as a sign that something had resolved. Not everything, but something. She was turning down the hall to the servants' stairs that evening when Nathaniel appeared from the direction of the front study. He'd changed from his day clothes, which meant he'd had time to settle a good sign. He's withdrawing the letter to the lawyer, he said. No preamble. Is that what he wants? It's what I asked him for. Nathaniel stopped in front of her, and he agreed on one condition. She waited. He wants to make an acknowledgement, private. No lawyers, no legal record, just a conversation with the household present. He wants to say in this house in front of the people who work here what your grandmother was to him and what you are to this family. He held her gaze. He wants to say it out loud. He says some things don't need documents. They just need witnesses. Eliza felt something in her chest catch and then release. When? She said. Tomorrow morning, after breakfast. He paused. You can say no. He won't press. I'm not going to say no. He looked at her steadily. No, he said. I didn't think you would. She started to step past him toward the stairs. He didn't move exactly, but his presence shifted a small, almost imperceptible thing, the way a door that was almost closed becomes almost open. Eliza, he said. She stopped. She turned. He looked at her with everything carefully held in and everything visible anyway, because there are men who are very good at hiding what they feel, and there are moments that are larger than that ability, and this was one of those moments. What happens after tomorrow? He said. After my father has said his piece and the household has heard it, what do you want to happen? She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about her $4 and her worn leather bag and the promise she'd made to her mother. She thought about her grandmother in Hollow Creek, keeping a greeting alive for 40 years, keeping a name alive, sending a granddaughter out into the world with her own face and her own voice. Some things have to be kept. I'd like to stay, she said. If there's still a place for me here. The expression on his face was not a smile. It was something slower and more considered than a smile, something that settled into his features, like the end of a long tension, like a window being opened in a room that has been closed too long. "There's a place for you," he said. "There has been since the morning you walked through that door." She met his eyes, held them, let the words be what they were. Then she said goodnight and went upstairs and sat on the edge of her narrow bed in her narrow room and pressed her grandmother's letter, which Samuel had let her keep against her chest with both hands, and breathed. Outside, the summer night moved through New York without asking anyone's permission. And in the house below her, something that had been waiting 37 years to be finished finally began to find its ending. She didn't sleep much. She lay on her narrow bed with her grandmother's letter on the pillow beside her and listened to the house settle and breathe around her, all its old timber and old secrets and old grief. And she thought about the morning ahead and what it would ask of everyone who woke up to it. She was dressed and downstairs before any of the others again. She put the kettle on again. She stood with her hands around her own elbows again. But this morning it felt different. Not the braced, heavy weighting of a woman carrying something she didn't yet understand, but the particular stillness of someone who has come to the edge of something and is simply waiting for it to begin. Dolly came in at 5:30, and this time she didn't pretend not to have questions. She stood in the doorway and looked at Eliza and said, "Is it true what Ruth said that Mr. Samuel is going to make some kind of announcement this morning?" "I believe so," Eliza said. Dolly's eyes were very wide and very earnest. "About you. About my grandmother," Eliza said. "And about what she meant to this house. A long time ago." Dolly stood quietly for a moment, processing this with the visible effort of someone whose world was reorganizing itself in real time. Then she said, "Are you scared?" Eliza thought about it. "No," she said, and meant it. Dolly nodded slowly. "Okay." She moved to set the table. Then, without looking up, "I'm glad you're staying." Eliza looked at her. "How did you know I was staying?" "Mr. Nathaniel told Ruth. Ruth told me." Dolly aligned a cup with the precision of someone making careful work of something simple. "He said it like it was already settled, like it was a fact." She paused. "He doesn't say things like that unless they are." Eliza turned back to the kettle. She allowed herself exactly 10 seconds to feel the warmth of that before she pressed it into place alongside everything else she was carrying and set her mind to the morning. By 8 o'clock, the household was assembled. Not formally. Samuel hadn't staged it that way. There was no arrangement of chairs, no cleared space, no ceremony that might have made it feel like a performance. He had simply asked Mrs. Whitmore to have the staff in the main hall at 8, and Mrs. Whitmore, whose expression when she delivered the instruction suggested she had more feelings about it than she intended to show, had done exactly that. They stood in a loose cluster, Mrs. Whitmore straight-backed and unreadable, Ruth with her hands folded, Dolly trying not to look as nervous as she was. The kitchen staff quiet the two stable hands who'd been called in from the grounds, looking uncertain about why they were there. Clara was not present. Eliza had expected that, had made her peace with it before the morning started. Nathaniel stood to one side of the hall's center. He looked at Eliza when she came in and gave her a single small nod that said everything it needed to say without saying anything at all. Samuel Van Dorn came down the stairs at 8 sharp. He was dressed for the day with more deliberateness than Eliza had seen before. Coat pressed, cravat neat, the whole of him carrying a kind of intention that his body hadn't worn in the days since the sitting room. He looked, she thought, like a man who had made a decision and was now inhabiting it. He stopped at the foot of the stairs and looked at the assembled household. His staff of 20 years, his son, and Eliza standing at the edge of the group. "I'll be brief," he said. "I'm not a man who speaks in speeches, and you all know that, so I'll ask you to bear with me if this comes out rough." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed particularly loud. "Most of you know some version of what's happened this past week," he said. "Word moves in a house. That's not a complaint. It's just true. So I'll tell you the whole of it myself because you've served this family honestly, and you deserve an honest accounting." He told them. Not everything. Not the letter. Not Caroline's specific act. Not the machinery of it. That was private, and it was going to stay private. But he told them about Margaret Ward, about Hollow Creek, about 37 years of believing the wrong thing. He told them that the young woman standing at the edge of their group was the granddaughter of someone this house should have known about long ago, and that her presence here was not coincidence and not trouble, but something he intended to call what it was, a gift late in arriving that he was not too proud or too old to receive. He told them that Eliza Harper was to be treated with the full respect owed a member of this household in a position of trust, that her situation was changing, not yet defined in every particular, but changing, and that anyone who took issue with that was welcome to bring their issue to him directly. He stopped. The hall was perfectly quiet. Then he said to Eliza, specifically across the space between them, "Your grandmother was the finest person I have ever known in my life. I am sorry she never heard me say that. I am saying it now because better late than not at all is the only wisdom I have left, and I intend to use it." Eliza stood her ground. She held his gaze. She did not trust her voice to say anything that would do justice to the moment. So she dipped her head, not a servant's bow, not a social nicety, but the specific inclination of a woman acknowledging something sacred, and let that speak for itself. Dolly cried. Not loudly, just a small, helpless sound that she muffled immediately with her hand, but it broke the seal of the room's silence, and the rest of it followed the collective exhale. The shift of weight, the rustle of people coming back into themselves after being very still. Mrs. Whitmore turned to Eliza. Her expression was not warm exactly, but it was genuine. "Miss Harper," she said, and something in the way she said it, the weight she put on the miss, the deliberateness of it, told Eliza that the woman had made her own private peace with things. "Mrs. Whitmore," Eliza said. That was all. It was enough. The trouble arrived an hour later. She should have known Edward wouldn't stay gone. She'd thought about it the night before, the calculating look in his eyes, the way he'd noted everything in that sitting room and filed it away. And she'd known in the practical part of herself that her mother had sharpened and her grandmother had honed that a man like that didn't retreat. He regrouped. He came with a letter. Not in person this time, he sent a rider, which was more elegant and considerably more unpleasant, because it meant he'd had time to have something drafted. The rider arrived at the front door and asked for Mr. Nathaniel Van Dorn, and Nathaniel was the one who received it and opened it, and Eliza, who was crossing the upper landing and heard the exchange, came down the stairs in time to see him read it. She watched his face, watched the careful control of it hold for exactly as long as it needed to, and then stop being careful entirely. "What does it say?" she asked. He looked up from the letter. His voice when he spoke was very even, the way a floor is very even just before it gives way. "He's petitioned the family solicitor. He's arguing that any formal change in Eliza Harper's status within this household, or any acknowledgement of a family connection to the Ward line, constitutes grounds for reviewing the terms of my grandfather's estate, as the original entailment included specific language about family recognition and outside claims." He folded the letter. "He's claiming that my father's acknowledgement this morning could be read as opening a legal door to a challenge against the estate." "Can it?" Eliza said. "No," Nathaniel said flatly. "It's nonsense. My father made a personal statement to his household staff. He didn't sign anything, he didn't file anything, he didn't alter any legal document. Edward knows that." He set the letter down. "This is pressure. It's not law. It's a man trying to frighten my father into silence using the threat of law. What does he want? He wants you gone." Nathaniel said it without apology or softening, just the truth laid flat. "He wants this settled back the way it was before you arrived, with my father quiet and the Ward name buried. Because as long as this stays complicated, there's the possibility, however unlikely, that my father might choose to formalize something. And Edward has been positioning himself as next of kin for 20 years. Eliza was quiet for a moment. "What are you going to do?" Nathaniel looked at her with the full attention she'd come to understand was his most honest mode. "What would you like me to do?" She hadn't expected that. The directness of it, the way he handed the decision to her as if it was hers to make. As if her answer mattered in the particular and serious way that things matter when someone actually intends to act on them. She thought about it. "Write back," she said. Not to Edward, to the solicitor directly. Request a formal opinion on whether a personal statement made privately constitutes any legal action whatsoever. Make him show his argument in legal language to an actual lawyer. My guess is the argument disappears when it has to be real. Nathaniel looked at her for a moment. Then, "That is exactly what my father's lawyer is going to say." "I know," she said. "But it's better coming from the solicitor than from us." He picked up the letter, turned it over in his hands once. Then he looked at her with the expression she was starting to think of as his truest one, the one that didn't perform composure, but simply had it because it came from something genuine underneath. "Where did you learn to think like that?" he said. "Hollow Creek," she said. "When you don't have money or name, you learn to use whatever's actually true. The truth is almost always enough if you know how to aim it." He walked toward the study, stopped at the door, and turned back. "Stay close today," he said, "in case my father needs you." "I'm not going anywhere," she said. He looked at her. Something passed through his expression that wasn't quite a smile, but was its older, quieter cousin. Then he went in and closed the door.
"He with you."
Clara found her at noon. Eliza was in the back garden, not working, just standing in the summer heat, with her face turned toward the sky and her eyes closed, allowing herself 10 minutes of not being needed before the afternoon required her again. She heard the footsteps and recognized them before she turned. Clara stood a few feet away with her traveling bag in one hand and her coat folded over her arm. She was dressed for leaving. Her face was the face of a woman who has arrived at the end of a very long interior argument and is still not entirely at peace with the outcome, but has decided to speak regardless. "I owe you something," Clara said. Eliza opened her eyes, said nothing, waited. "I knew about the letter," Clara said. "Caroline's letter, the one from RT." The words landed like stones dropped into still water. "I found it," Clara said, 3 years ago, when she died. I was going through her personal things, she asked me to specifically. Said there were things that needed to be handled by someone who understood the value of discretion. She pressed her lips together. "I found it in the bottom of her traveling case, the one she kept locked. I read it. I understood immediately what it meant." Eliza breathed in. "And you hid it." "I put it in the box, with the rest of her correspondence. I couldn't destroy it, I tried. I held it over the candle, and I couldn't—" Clara stopped. "But I couldn't bring it to anyone either. She was 3 days dead. Samuel was in the kind of grief that you don't load things onto. Nathaniel had just lost his mother." She looked at Eliza directly. There was no good moment. And then the months passed and there was never going to be a good moment, and so I kept it buried and I told myself it was done. Eliza looked at her. "But you kept it." "Yes," Clara said it simply. "I kept it because I couldn't destroy it. Because some part of me, some part I didn't want to examine very closely, knew that burying it wasn't the same as ending it." A pause. "And then you came, looking like her, saying that greeting. And I knew." She exhaled. "I knew it was going to come out. I could see it the moment Samuel heard that greeting. Something in him, the way he looked at you, I knew. And you tried to stop it." "I tried to slow it," Clara corrected with a precision that felt like the most honest thing she'd said. "I told myself I was protecting the family, protecting his memory of his mother." She looked away. "But I was protecting myself too, from having to account for 3 years of knowing and saying nothing." The garden was quiet around them. Summer birds, distant sound of the street. "Clara," Eliza said, and kept her voice even. "Why are you telling me this now?" Clara looked back at her. "Because I'm leaving, and because a person shouldn't leave a place carrying more than they came in with." A beat. "And because you were right. He deserved to know. Your grandmother deserved to be found even 37 years late." She looked at the bag in her hand. "I'm not sorry for loving Caroline. I'm not sorry for who she was to me. But I'm sorry I buried that letter." Her voice was steady, but the steadiness was costing her. "I should have done something with it sooner. I didn't. And that's mine to carry." Eliza looked at her for a long moment. At this woman who had served a family for 15 years, who had loved her mistress with the fierce loyalty of someone who doesn't divide that feeling easily, who had found a terrible thing and not known what to do with it, and had chosen the path of least immediate damage, and lived with the weight of that choice for 3 years alone. "I'm not going to tell Nathaniel," Eliza said. Clara looked up. "What you found and when, that's between you and your own conscience. You didn't destroy the letter. You left it where it could be found." She paused. "I found it. It served its purpose. The accounting doesn't need to get any more complicated than that." Clara stood very still for a moment. Something moved across her face, relief and shame, and something that might have been gratitude, all tangled together into an expression that had no clean name. "You're a great deal kinder than you needed to be," Clara said. "My grandmother raised me," Eliza said. "She was very specific about when kindness was required." Clara nodded. "Once." Then she straightened her coat over her arm and picked up her bag and said, "Fare thee bright, Miss Harper." She said it correctly, every syllable exactly right, as if she had heard it and held it and practiced it in the privacy of wherever she'd been since the morning it first broke open in that East Wing study. Eliza looked at her. "Fare thee bright, Clara." The woman walked away without looking back, and Eliza stood in the summer garden and let the silence take the space she'd left. And then she breathed, and then she let it go. She found Samuel in the late afternoon. He was standing before the portrait of Caroline, not the one of Margaret Ward in the study, but the formal portrait in the upper hall, the one painted 6 years into the marriage, when Caroline Van Dorn had been settled and certain and fully in possession of the life she'd fought for. He heard her footsteps and didn't turn. She came and stood beside him, the way she'd stood beside Nathaniel, looking at the other portrait, and for a moment it was just two people looking at a painting of a complicated woman. "I keep thinking about what she must have felt," Samuel said, "knowing every day that part of me was somewhere else, that she'd bought my presence, but not all of it." He was quiet. "She was not a cruel woman. She was a frightened one, and frightened people do things they can't undo, and then they spend the rest of their lives arranging the furniture around the fact of what they did." "Did you love her?" Eliza asked. Eventually. He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I respected her. I was faithful to her. I was grateful for Nathaniel. I was—" He stopped. "I was as present as I knew how to be. Whether that constitutes love, I genuinely don't know." He looked at the portrait. "I think she knew. I think she was always trying to get to the part of me she'd had to go around to get there, and I think she never quite could." A long pause. "That's a sad way to live a life." "It is," Eliza agreed. "I'm not angry at her," he said. "That surprises me. I thought I would be, but what I feel is—" He stopped. "Sad for her. That she felt she had to. That she had no other way she could see." He looked at Eliza. "Your grandmother had more grace than I deserved, living her life quietly, keeping what she kept sending you out into the world, carrying the one thing that would find me." He shook his head. "She forgave me before I knew I needed forgiving." Eliza felt the truth of that settle into her bones. "She always said the meanest thing you could do to a person was hold their worst moment against them forever," Eliza said. "She said people carry enough of that themselves without anyone else adding to the pile." Samuel looked at her. And the smile that crossed his face was soft and old, and full of something that had been kept a very long time and was finally allowed to breathe. "That is entirely the kind of thing she would say," he said. "Absolutely entirely." He turned away from the portrait. He straightened his coat. He looked for a moment like a man who has completed something not happily, not without loss, but completely. The way you look when a chapter is closed, that needed closing regardless of how the chapter ended. "I want to do something for Hollow Creek," he said. Privately. A donation the school or the church or whatever they need most. In Margaret's name. He looked at Eliza. Would you help me write the letter? Yes, she said. I'd be glad to. She found Nathaniel on the front steps as the evening came in. He'd been outside for a while, she could tell by the way he was sitting, the coat off his sleeves, rolled the posture of a man who had given himself permission to stop managing things for the hour. He heard her and moved over without being asked, which was a small gesture, and said a great deal. She sat beside him. Edward's lawyer wrote back, he said. 3 hours. The argument is legally baseless, which is what I told Edward, and what anyone with 2 minutes of legal education could have told him. He looked at the street. He won't push further. He doesn't have grounds and he knows it. Good, Eliza said. He's going to be unpleasant at family occasions for the next decade. He sounds like he already was. Fair point. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Then, my father seems lighter. Did you notice that? Yes. Not happy exactly. I don't think he's going to be happy about this, not in the simple way. There's too much grief woven into it. He looked at her. But lighter. Like something's been redistributed. Put in the right places instead of all in one place. A pause. That's because of you. That's because of the truth, she said. I just found the end of the thread. You pulled it, he said. Not everyone would have. She looked at him. The evening light was doing something kind to the angles of his face, softening the control out of it. So what was left was just the man, tired and honest, and holding something he hadn't quite said yet with both hands. Nathaniel, she said. He looked at her. You said there's a place for me here. I need to know what that means. Not the household position, I understand that's being figured out. I mean what it means. She held his gaze. Because I'm not a woman who stays somewhere on maybes. He was quiet for a moment. Not the controlled quiet of a man buying time. The quiet of a man who is deciding how much of the truth to say out loud and arriving at the answer, all of it. It means, he said, that I have not thought about anything the way I've been thinking about you in the past week. It means that every conversation we've had has been the most honest conversation I've had in 3 years. It means... He stopped. Looked at her directly. It means that when my father described your grandmother as the finest person he'd ever known, I thought I understand that, for entirely different reasons, and in considerably less time. He paused. I'm not asking you anything right now. I know this is not the moment, and you have not been here long, and the whole house is still settling, but I'm answering your question. That's what it means. She looked at him for a long moment. That's a very controlled way of saying something very large, she said. Yes, he agreed. It is. I'm working on it. She almost laughed. Not quite. It was the almost laugh that comes when something is genuinely funny, and also genuinely something else. Something that doesn't have a word but lives in the chest just below the sternum and stays warm longer than it should. I'm not going anywhere, she said. I told you that. You did. Then we have time to be less controlled about it, she said. Eventually. He looked at her. And this time, the not-quite smile made it all the way. Not large, not performed. Just real the way a thing is real when it's been waiting a long time to be allowed to exist and has finally been given the room. Eventually. He agreed. They sat together on the front steps of the Van Dorn house as the summer evening came down over New York, and neither of them spoke for a while. And neither of them needed to. That night, Eliza sat at the small desk in her room and unfolded her grandmother's letter, the one Samuel had kept for 37 years, the one that had waited in an old envelope with her grandmother's name on it, and she read it again. Every word of it. The specific, plain love of it. The way it catalogued all the right things. The way it ended. Fare thee bright, Margaret, wherever you are. Fare thee bright. She folded it back along its creases. She held it in both hands. She thought about her grandmother in Hollow Creek, in the kitchen, pressing a greeting into a small girl's mouth like a coin into a palm. Don't let it die. Some things have to be kept. She thought about what it meant to keep something. Not to hoard it, not to bury it, not to seal it in an envelope that never got sent, to keep it alive, moving, carried forward through the hands of people who didn't yet know what they were carrying or where it was going. Her grandmother had sent her into the world with a face and a voice and a greeting, and the greeting had walked through a door and found a man who had been waiting for it for 37 years, and the man's son was sitting on the front steps an hour ago, saying things with controlled language that meant something large and real and alive. Some things have to be kept. Some things kept long enough and carried faithfully enough find their way home on their own, and the women who keep them never know the whole of what they've done. And that is perhaps as it should be, because the best things are rarely done for the recognition of them. Eliza Harper set the letter down. She straightened her back. She looked at the single window of her narrow room and at the dark summer sky beyond it, and she understood fully and finally what her grandmother had given her. Not just the greeting, not just the face, not just the connection to a house and a history and a man who needed what she carried. Her grandmother had given her the map, and Eliza had followed it all the way to the place it was always pointed. She was not a maid who had stumbled into someone else's story. She was the end of a thread that had been carefully laid across 37 years of grief and silence and the stubborn, faithful keeping of small sacred things, and she had picked it up and followed it, and brought it here to this house, to this family, to this man who had wept for the first time in 3 years when she said 4 words in an old kitchen language that the world had mostly forgotten. Fare thee bright. That was not an accident. That was not coincidence. That was a woman in Hollow Creek, Massachusetts, who had loved someone all her life in the only way she had left to love him, by sending everything she had of herself forward into the world and trusting that what needed to be found would find its way to being found. Margaret Harper had kept her promise, and Eliza, her granddaughter, had kept hers. The Van Dorn house settled around her in the summer dark, full of old grief put finally to rest, and 2 men who had each lost something, and were each in their separate and necessary ways beginning to understand what they had found, and a woman who had come with $4 and a leather bag and a greeting she hadn't known was a key until she'd already used it to open the door. Some stories end the way they were always going to end. Not easily, not without cost, not without the accumulated weight of all the wrong turns that brought them there, but rightly, with the rightness of a thing that has finally been allowed to be what it was always meant to be. This was one of those stories. And it had been waiting 37 years for Eliza Harper to walk through the door and say hello.